Today, I'm going to introduce a recently released suspense thriller. This film is written and directed by V1RUS, who is known as the father of Saw. It is his latest work since The Invisible Man, and this time, the horror factor is even closer to a true story. The story begins on a remote farm in Ohio in 1995. This secluded place is sparsely populated, relying on a generator for electricity, and food is grown in simple plastic greenhouses. On the surface, farm life appears to be a peaceful paradise, but in reality, a dark secret is hidden within. The protagonist, Blake, is an 8-year-old boy. Every morning, after eating breakfast on time, his father takes him deep into the forest for basic training. Their family has lived here for generations, so learning to hunt is a necessary skill. His father tells him that death is the simplest thing in the world, but staying alive requires specific survival techniques. During their conversation, a lost deer suddenly appears ahead. Blake's father quickly signals him to get ready, and just as they aim their rifles at the prey, the deer moves into a blind spot. Disappointed, the father lowers his gun, only to realize that his son has disappeared. Blake had moved to the other side, thinking he would get a better angle on the target. But when he takes a closer look at the prey in front of him, he realizes in horror that it has taken on a human form. Startled, he looks again, but the shadowy figure has vanished. His father scolds him for acting on his own, and as Blake is about to defend himself, a strange growl suddenly echoes from ahead. This sound is unlike any animal they have ever heard. A terrifying sense of the unknown engulfs them, and they immediately flee with their rifles. They are lucky to find a shelter and quickly climb up to hide. The father instinctively points his gun at the entrance, his heart pounding as footsteps grow closer. The suffocating tension builds. Though there is still a wooden barrier between them, the creature's heavy breathing is eerily clear. In a desperate moment, the father decides to take the initiative and fires his gun, but when he looks around, there is nothing in sight. It seems like the shot hit something, because a horrifying, blood-curdling screech fills the entire forest.
这一枪好像打中了
Blake
猎物。
asks what happened outside. His father replies, just a bear. But it is clear that this is a comforting lie. Whatever was out there was far more terrifying than a bear. Father and son finally return to the safety of their warm farm. Given what happened during the day, the father reports the incident to his friend over the radio. Their conversation reveals that an unspeakable horror lurks within the forest. The father urges his friend to come immediately. They must eliminate it before it's too late. They also recall that an explorer had gone missing in the area a few days earlier. Perhaps, the thing they shot today was that person. Unbeknownst to them, Blake overhears everything. And from that moment on, he learns the terrible secret. Time flies, and 30 years pass in the blink of an eye. Blake is now an adult living in San Francisco. He has long forgotten his childhood on the farm and no longer remembers the secret he once overheard. He now has a happy family of 3 and believes that life will continue peacefully. But a sudden event shatters this illusion. After work one day, his wife hands him a letter. It turns out that his father, the man who hid the terrible secret, has passed away. His father's old friend has sent him the keys to the farmhouse, urging him to return and settle his father's affairs as soon as possible. With no other choice, Blake rents a moving truck and takes his wife and daughter on a journey back to his childhood home. As they approach the old farmhouse, they find the road blocked for unknown reasons. Confused, Blake checks the map, but there's no signal in this desolate area. At that moment, his daughter notices a figure near a distant shelter. It seems like someone is there. Blake turns to look and indeed sees a man carrying a rifle approaching them. After a brief conversation, Blake realizes that this man is his childhood friend. Though they haven't seen each other in years, his friend is still warm and welcoming. He explains that the mountain road ahead has collapsed, and only he knows another way through. With that, the 4 of them set off together, hoping to reach the farmhouse before nightfall. But as darkness falls, they are still on the road. Distracted by their conversation, Blake loses focus while driving, and an accident occurs. Fortunately, a large tree stops the vehicle, preventing any injuries. His friend rushes to open the car door, only to suddenly fall from a steep drop, disappearing from sight. Realizing the danger, Blake tells his family to stay under the car while he assesses the situation. Suddenly, a familiar growl echoes through the forest. Blake is instantly reminded of the terrifying experience from his childhood. Instinctively, he tries to shut the car door, but before he can react, a swift black shadow flashes past. A violent impact leaves a deep cut on his arm. Luckily, the mysterious figure does not attack again. It drags his injured friend away instead. Once the area falls silent, the terrified family scrambles out of the car and runs for their lives, fearing that the creature will return. Eventually, Blake leads them to the old farmhouse. He has no idea what that thing outside is, but one thing is certain, it is extremely dangerous. After a series of violent impacts, the creature at the door gradually stops its attack. However, from the sound of its footsteps, it hasn't left. Blake forces himself to stay calm. He quickly checks all doors and windows to ensure the only exit is sealed. Then, he heads to the basement to find the power switch. Because in this terrifying night, only light can bring a sense of safety. Before continuing to the next story, don't forget to subscribe to the Movie Recaps Lock channel. Subscribing is free. As the generator outside restarted, the entire farm was reconnected to the power supply. After finishing everything, Blake comforted his daughter, telling her to go to sleep. They still had no idea what was lurking outside, only that it was a humanoid creature, dangerous and aggressive. However, their most urgent concern was finding a way to call for help. Since their phones had no signal in this remote location, Blake immediately thought of his father's old radio. But no matter how much he adjusted the frequency or shouted into the microphone, there was no response. At that moment, his wife found a set of keys and guessed that one of them might belong to their car. As they talked, Blake suddenly mentioned smelling cooked meat, but his wife dismissed it, saying that was impossible. Following the scent, Blake opened a heavy iron door, revealing the source, dried meat stored in a room. He was puzzled by his own sense of smell. How could he detect the aroma through a sealed door? Without overthinking, he casually took a bite, but the moment he bit down, he felt an intense pain, his tooth cracked instantly. His wife, noticing his distress, rushed over to check on him. That's when she also saw the blood on his arm. At first, they assumed he had been cut by glass, but when she lifted his sleeve, they saw deep claw marks. At this moment, neither of them realized that Blake's body was undergoing a transformation. A few minutes later, Blake gathered tools to reinforce the doors. However, his wife stared at him strangely, and their daughter stood motionless, watching him in an unsettling way. An eerie feeling crept over Blake. He told them to go to bed, but they remained still, as if they didn't understand what he was saying. Deciding to ignore them, he knelt down to continue his work. Then, something disturbing happened. His body suddenly felt off balance, and as he reached for a hammer, it slipped and struck his hand. At the same time, he heard footsteps inside the house. Looking around, he saw that his wife and daughter were fast asleep. So where was the sound coming from? He cautiously followed the noise, his pulse quickening. When he finally opened a door, his scalp tingled with fear. Inside was a spider. It was at that moment that Blake realized something horrifying. His hearing had become incredibly sensitive. He could detect even the faintest movements, allowing him to pinpoint anything around him. However, he hadn't yet learned to control this ability. The sudden influx of noise overwhelmed his brain, nearly making him pass out. Fortunately, the chaos subsided quickly, and he adapted to his new sensory perception. Focusing, he could clearly hear that the creature outside had not left. His wife, awakened by his movements, sat up. Blake gestured for her to stay silent and used his heightened hearing to locate the exact position of the creature. It was lurking by the back door. With his wife's help, they managed to wound the creature, forcing it to retreat. Blake had narrowly escaped death once again. His wife, now frantic, checked his injuries. But when she spoke to him, Blake could no longer understand a single word. The pain in his leg intensified, and before he could process what was happening, he blacked out. By the time he regained consciousness, it was past 1 a.m. The house was eerily silent. His wife and daughter were nowhere to be seen. As he focused his new senses, his heightened hearing picked up a sound coming from the basement. Following the noise, he descended the stairs and discovered his wife had hidden their daughter there. Blake was about to call out to her when he overheard her speaking into the radio, desperately calling for help. But what she said made his blood run cold. The familiar scene triggered a buried memory from his childhood, specifically, that terrifying night when he overheard his father's conversation. It was then that he learned an unspeakable secret. Deep in the forest, there was a creature known as M0NSTER, a predatory beast that infected its victims through bites, turning them into werewolves. During the transformation from human to werewolf, a person's humanity would slowly disappear, replaced by an overpowering animal instinct. And now, it was clear, Blake had been infected. His cells were mutating at an alarming rate. In fact, the moment his wife had bandaged his arm, he had already lost his ability to speak human language. Every word he had uttered since then had been incomprehensible to them, because he was no longer speaking as a human, but as a beast. This explained why no one had understood him. His wife, quick thinking, grabbed a pen and paper, hoping he could still write. With trembling hands, Blake tried to hold the pen, but his fingers had already lost their dexterity. In despair, he managed to scrawl a single word: dying. Seeing this, his wife reassured him, promising that she would find a way to cure him. But as they spoke, his condition deteriorated further. He could no longer hear her voice. He couldn't even communicate his thoughts. His senses were being entirely overtaken by his beastly nature, his connection to the human world slipping away. His daughter's worried gaze pierced through him, but he didn't know what to do. Then, his wife noticed his arm bleeding again. She moved to rebandage the wound, only to discover that it had begun to fester. Strangely, Blake felt nothing at all. Then, something terrifying happened. The scent of blood triggered a primal hunger inside him. Without warning, he sank his teeth into his own arm, gnawing at it wildly. And then, his eyes turned toward his wife. A terrifying conflict raged within him. His human side and beastly instincts fought for control. For now, his lingering humanity kept him from attacking further. But his wife realized something horrifying: if they didn't escape soon, it would be too late. That's when she spotted an old pickup truck in the yard. She immediately remembered the keys she had found earlier. Acting fast, she retrieved a car battery from the basement, grabbed a knife, and cautiously opened the back door. They moved in complete silence. Even closing the car door was done with extreme care. Lifting the hood, she connected the battery. She needed it to start the truck. Once everything was ready, she slid into the driver's seat and pressed the gas pedal. The engine roared to life. The deafening noise echoed through the night, painfully loud. But miraculously, the creature didn't appear. She knew they had only moments to escape. For continuing to the next story, don't forget to subscribe to the Movie Recaps Lock channel. Subscribing is free. His wife immediately shifted gears, ready to leave. But in the next second, several figures suddenly scrambled away from the car in a panic. In their desperation, they climbed onto the nearest plastic greenhouse. Although it seemed like a safe spot, the flimsy structure wouldn't hold them for long. Below them, the creature launched another attack. Its claws were razor-sharp, nearly swiping them with every strike. In the face of danger, Blake made a decision. He told his family to return to the house while he stayed behind to distract the monster. Then, without hesitation, he leapt off the greenhouse. His wife didn't dare hesitate. She grabbed their daughter and rushed back into the house. Outside, terrifying roars echoed through the night. But just as quickly as they came, an eerie silence followed. Worried about her husband, his wife cautiously peeked outside, and saw Blake standing at the door. Nervously, she opened it, but what she saw left her utterly speechless. Blake had undergone another transformation. His facial features were now grotesquely distorted, and his teeth had grown into fangs. Their daughter stepped forward, gently touching his face. Blake wished he could suppress his growing hunger, but the surging energy within him was uncontrollable. Suddenly, his palms split open as his transformation accelerated. Losing control, he lunged at his wife. Yet she stood completely still, her fear fading into calm acceptance. She no longer cared about her own life, only whether her husband could ever return to his human self. Realizing he was a danger to his family, Blake knew he had to leave immediately. If he stayed, he feared he might tear them apart in the next moment. But just as he opened the door, the monster outside burst in. In an instant, the two creatures clashed, locked in a vicious and blood-soaked battle. Perhaps because Blake's transformation was incomplete, he quickly found himself at a disadvantage. His wife, seeing this, intervened, repeatedly attacking the creature to distract it. The constant interference frustrated the monster, giving Blake the opening he needed. Seizing the moment, he lunged forward and sank his teeth into its throat, biting down with all his might. He didn't stop until the creature was dead, but as he stood up, he was met with a horrifying revelation. The monster was his father. His father had also been infected by Shanra. Staring at the unthinkable scene before him, and at his terrified wife, Blake's mind spiraled into chaos. Overwhelmed, he fled, yet he didn't get far before his body underwent its ultimate transformation. Just as the legends described, Blake had finally completed his evolution. He was no longer human. He had become a werewolf. When he rose to his feet, his vision had completely changed. The darkness of the night was now as bright as daylight. Inside the house, his wife and daughter clung to each other, still shaken. Suddenly, the entire house lost power. A terrible realization struck his wife. She rushed to the window. What she saw confirmed her worst fears. Blake was no longer Blake. The man she had known was gone. His eyes were unrecognizable, foreign. As his monstrous figure disappeared into the shadows, she instinctively shielded her daughter and remained on high alert. Then, faint footsteps echoed from upstairs. She immediately picked up a knife from the floor and crept toward the staircase, carefully observing. As Blake drew closer, she had no choice but to swing the blade at him. The momentary pain gave her just enough time to grab their daughter and flee. Not far from the house, they found a storage barn. In the pitch-black darkness, they could barely see anything. But by sheer luck, she found a flashlight on a shelf, and a hunting trap. A plan quickly formed in her mind. She and her daughter hid in a corner, waiting. Before long, Blake followed their scent and arrived. He rammed against the barn door repeatedly but couldn't break through. Instead, he began digging beneath it. Moments later, everything went silent. His wife dared not move, unable to see what was happening. But in Blake's eyes, everything was crystal clear. The entire barn was as bright as if it were lit by the sun. Just as she prepared to act, he stepped forward, and his foot landed directly in the trap she had set. The iron chains locked tightly around him. Taking advantage of the moment, she grabbed her daughter and fled. Blake, furious at losing his prey, flew into a rage. With no other option, he crouched down and used his immense strength to snap the trap. Minutes later, he emerged, his leg mangled and bleeding, but he pushed forward, chasing after them on all fours. At the same time, his wife was running desperately. Soon, she heard his enraged howls behind her. She realized that running aimlessly would only lead to their doom. Thinking fast, she changed direction and ran toward the site of their earlier car accident. After searching frantically, she found Blake's childhood friend's hunting rifle. Without hesitation, she took the weapon and continued moving forward with her daughter. Just before dawn, they discovered a shelter. But just as they climbed up to hide, Blake, dragging his wounded leg, caught up to them. The overwhelming presence of the monster sent chills down their spines. Trembling, his wife raised the rifle. Blake slowly stepped into view. He locked eyes with them, but did not attack. It was clear that a sliver of his humanity remained. But it was fading fast. His wife hesitated, unwilling to pull the trigger. And then, Blake made one final, desperate choice. At last, he was free. In the end, his wife and daughter left the farm. As they passed a familiar landscape, they found themselves stopping involuntarily. Perhaps this was fate, because when Blake was 8 years old, he had once stood in this very spot, gazing at the horizon. And with that, the story came to an end. May those who click the subscribe button be blessed with abundant fortune and always be in good health. Thank you.